This project is funded by FORMUS, Government Council for Sustainability Development, and in collaboration with the Beijer Institute of Ecological Economics at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and the Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University. My name is Tracy Curry. I am the owner and principal of Northern Social Environmental Research based in Fairbanks, Alaska, and a member of the project team. I'll be your moderator for today. We are so excited to have you here so that we may together and from multiple viewpoints further arguments around inequality as a key consideration in climate change narratives and research. But first, before we get into the program, I have a little bit of housekeeping. First, there are 3 emergency exits, 1 located here and 2 up here. You should know that there's no eating or drinking allowed in this room. Also, a reminder to please silence your cell phones. For your information, there is an outlet charger conveniently located under each of your chairs. This event is being recorded. There is an excellent sound system in this room with multiple microphones all around. So we don't need to pass around individual microphones, but also please be aware that your side conversations may be picked up and recorded as well. Just a quick overview of the seminar. We'll start with some welcomes and introductions, and follow that by our keynote from Lucas Chancel. Then we'll have a short break, and after which we'll begin the panel discussion. We'll have time for questions after the panel discussion, so we ask that you please hold your questions until then. And then we'll finish around 3 o'clock, and we hope you'll join us for a coffee mingle outside in the Beijer foyer. So first, just to start, Carl Folke originally planned to be here to give a welcome note, but sadly he cannot due to illness. Nothing serious, but he just can't be here today. He did provide us his notes, and I'll introduce him and share some of those notes with you now. Carl is the director of the Beijer Institute here at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. He is a pioneering force in sustainability science and has for several decades worked on the intertwined systems of people and nature as part of the Biosphere. Carl wanted to introduce the Beijer Young Scholars Program from which the Inequality and Biosphere projects emerged, as well as share how the topic on inequality and the Biosphere came about. The Beijer Young Scholars Program is an international program initiated by the Beijer Institute in 2012 to foster collaboration among early career researchers from diverse disciplines. Through workshops and joint research, members explore key sustainability challenges such as inequality in the biosphere by promoting interdisciplinary approaches to social ecological systems. Despite an awareness of large-scale inequalities within and between countries and its social impacts, there was, at the time, very little research that explicitly connected inequality with the biosphere. What that connection entails, and whether or how it matters for achieving a sustainable future within planetary boundaries. This observation led us at the Beijer Institute, Carl's words, to propose that the next cohort of Beijer Young Scholars focus on the theme of inequality in the biosphere. He sends his very best regards and is very sad to not be here with us today. So now I'll give an introduction to Micah Hamann, who is a project team member and will provide an introduction to the project. Micah Hamann is a senior lecturer in development and sustainability at the Centre for Geography and Environmental Science at the University of Exeter in the UK. She is also a research fellow at the Environment and Sustainability Institute at Exeter, as well as the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University, South Africa. Her research explores the relationship between people and nature, especially in fast-changing urban systems. In this context, Micah's current interests lie with the role of informality and nature connectedness in cities of the global south. She has led transdisciplinary research initiatives focusing on resilience and development in South Africa and has a particular interest in using participatory and arts-based futuring methods to co-imagine more just and sustainable futures. Please join me in welcoming Micah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Tracy, for that introduction. It's great to be here. It's great to see so many of you in the audience. And it is my distinct pleasure to provide you with a very brief introduction to this topic of inequality and the biosphere, at least an introduction to how we've been thinking about this topic. And by we, I mean this lovely group of people, most of whom I think are in the room today, and who represent the project group, the research group, that have been basically engaging with this topic for many years now. Like Tracy mentioned, going back all the way to 2016 when we were all young and sprightly and met for the first time as one of the cohorts of the Beijer Young Scholars. And to tell, and as you know, me standing here, obviously I'm just one of many in this research group, and I'm very honored and privileged to be representing the group here, and to tell you a little bit about our story and to take you back to the beginning to kind of help you understand our story. I'm going to ask you to kind of cast your mind back about 10 years or so. So around this time, 2015, 16, when you might recall that inequality, as also Tracy mentioned, that Carl had said, was suddenly a big sort of hot topic, and it was on everyone's minds. It was part of the public conversation. And that was for many reasons, including sort of the publication of some key books and reports and magazine articles that had come out around that time, including obviously Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which you might recall caused quite a splash, and some sort of influential Oxfam reports and other things that were going on, including sort of social movements and protest action. So if you remember in the early 2000s, there was the Occupy Wall Street movement, and then a bit later in the decade, the Yellow Vest protests in France. And really all of these things centered inequality and centered this concern around rising inequalities. And people were frustrated with the current economic system. They were concerned that people were being left behind. And that concern is also borne out in the data. And I'm not going to show you too many of these kinds of graphs because that is very much the domain of Lucas Chancel, who will be talking soon. I've taken this graph from a report he led, the World Inequality Report in 2022. And the reason I wanted to just show you this briefly is because it takes the long view of global income inequality. And without making too many assumptions about the age of people in this audience, I think it's fair to say that for most of us, it happened in our lifetime, that in the early 2000s, we saw this switch happen where inequality used to be this thing that was like an issue between countries almost, like there was the developing world and the developed world, and that was kind of how we understood inequality. But then what happened is, as you can see, between country inequality fell, and within country inequality rose quite sharply. So that means that suddenly inequality was in our faces, it was in our countries, it was in our cities, it was in our communities, which also helped fan this kind of frustration with the system, with the situation, and also, led us to kind of want to do some more research about this. But before I get to that, I just wanted to take a little bit of a step back and say, like, why are we even concerned about inequality beyond, the sort of moral imperative that we like to think of ourselves as all equal, But I think that there's a lot of research that, it makes sense to just mention some of the impacts, the social impacts that inequality has. There is, evidence that high levels of inequality are linked to poor social mobility, linked to high rates of crime, especially property crime, high rates or poor outcomes in terms of health, especially mental health. And inequality, especially over longer periods, is also linked to poor economic performance and potentially at this moment in time, pertinently, inequality, as shown by this very recent paper that came out in PNAS, has been shown to be one of the strongest predictors for the erosion of democracy. So these are not great things. These are things we should be concerned about, but these are social impacts, right? So the question is, what is the connection between inequality and the biosphere? So if we're interested in the biosphere, if you're interested in environmental impacts, what are the impacts of inequality on the biosphere and on the environment in terms of how we maybe relate to the environment, how we behave towards it, how we govern it, manage it, etc. So that's, there is a lot of sort of work that's already been done sort of in this field roughly, but we have a good understanding of kind of what happens at the extremes, right? We understand that, wealth, prosperity has impacts on the environment in terms of consumption, maybe overconsumption, waste generation, pollution, high CO2 footprints per capita, etc. So we know what happens at that end of the scale. What happens at the other end of the scale in terms of the impacts of poverty on the environment, we also have a pretty good understanding. And thankfully, that narrative has changed over the last few decades, because a lot of it used to be, well, poverty leads to environmental degradation, but we know that that's, it's not as straightforward as that. It's quite a nuanced and complex picture, and we know that a lot of poor and marginalized communities are actually excellent stewards of the environment. But so what I'm trying to say is there is a lot of sort of work that's been done on these sort of extremes, but what we found, where there hadn't been sort of a lot of work that we could find and research that was done at sort of trying to unpack the impact of that differential. What is it about inequality that has an impact on the environment? And so that's really the starting point for what we tried to distill when we were still working as the Beijer Young Scholars, and then published in 2018 this review that really tried to look at the relationships between inequality and the biosphere through that sort of social ecological systems lens. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the interactions between inequality and the biosphere, where we basically had a first stab at identifying mechanisms that we could find in the literature to help us explain how inequality was having an impact on the biosphere. And again, this was by no means a comprehensive literature review, but just a sort of a starting point for conversation. And if I were to kind of summarize those mechanisms in sort of two camps, there's the sort of process or mechanism by which you find yourself in a sort of situation when power over a resource is highly unequal. So for example, imagine in the case of fisheries, where there's a handful of actors that sort of control like the vast majority of the catch. In that kind of unequal situation, you have a very direct impact potentially on the resource and the environment more broadly. Whether or not that is a positive or negative thing for the resource and the environment sort of depends on the context and the sort of conditions and situation. But there is this sort of market concentration mechanism where that inequality can have a very direct impact on a resource and the environment. And then there's a sort of three other mechanisms that we describe in the paper that have more to do with sort of how inequalities influence how we behave towards the environment. So if you imagine, for example, in a society where there's, a lot of inequality, and you have this you're faced constantly with this lifestyle of the rich and famous, at some point you might be thinking, well, actually, I quite like that lifestyle as well. And I wonder also, like, that might change the way you behave, specifically when it comes to consumption, right? So it might change your consumption behavior. So there's something about inequalities, aspirations, and consumption behavior that needs unpacking. And then there's another kind of group of, another mechanism which is specific to when groups are managing a resource together, like a shared resource. If there are key inequalities in that group, it can make decision-making quite hard. It can make it hard for that group to come to agreements. So basically, there's something about inequalities in a group that can hinder or hamper cooperation. So that's another mechanism. And the final one that I want to just mention here is there's an interesting interplay between inequality and fairness, because sometimes it seems like the inequality itself doesn't matter so much. It matters whether people think of it as unfair. And if that happens, then sometimes there are sort of situations where people decide, well, this is unfair. I'm not going to, for example, follow the rules that have been put into place to protect a resource or some kind of an amenity or something. So these are so there's something about inequality and fairness that also needs more unpacking. So these were some of the mechanisms that we identified in that paper. Again, very much just a starting point. And then when that paper came out, that was about 2018. So we were just a few years after the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, right? So at the time, there was still a lot of conversations about these goals and how, the relationships between them and whether there was trade-offs and synergies between these goals. And so you can see that there are two goals that specifically talk to inequalities and reducing inequalities, and a number of goals that are specifically about, improving biosphere quality, protecting biodiversity, etc. And so we started to think of, how can we keep working on this really interesting topic and unpack some of the leads we've already made. And we started to frame it more in terms of how does this fit into the SDG framework? How can we think about inequality in the biosphere in terms of, for example, trade-offs between SDGs, which then led us to put together this proposal to form us, which was luckily funded, that also Tracy was mentioned at the beginning, the title of which is Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in an Unequal World. And the reason I'm showing you some fishing vessels and palm oil work here is because for this project, the key case study that we use to anchor a lot of our work in is Indonesia, because Indonesia is a country which has a very vibrant seafood and palm oil industry, and both of these industries, these extractive industries, are characterized by lots of different kinds of inequalities at different levels. So we thought it was a good place to kind of try and test some of our ideas. And in fact, some of our groups are looking specifically at these intercorporate sustainability initiatives within the seafood and palm oil sector. So in the palm oil sector, there's this roundtable for sustainable palm oil, which is also, the body that has a certification scheme for sustainable palm oil products, which you might have seen in the shops, and they usually cost a bit more. And then there's also in the seafood industry, there's this collective corporate initiative called CBOS, also again, corporations that are interested in improving the sustainability of their practices. And so part of our group is looking at comparing and contrasting these different initiatives, trying to understand, well, how are they actually having an impact on the ground in terms of environmental quality? Are they actually having an impact in terms of improving people's livelihoods and reducing inequalities in the system? And actually on that, one of the insights that I can already share, it's very preliminary work, but we were able to get data from the palm oil mills in Indonesia. So these are mills that buy the fresh palm fruit bunches from farmers and then make the crude palm oil, which they then sell on for further processing. And the idea is of these, certification schemes, which in a way you can think of as a kind of market concentration, that there's, people like you and me, consumers in the global north, we pay a price premium for, certified sustainable palm oil products. And then, hopefully that premium would somehow end up, with the people who are actually on the ground producing the stuff, the mills, the laborers, the farmers. But unfortunately, if you look at the data from the mills, and you don't worry too much about the details of the graph, really all I'm trying to show you is that the lines from before certification and never certified and after certification are basically the same line, meaning that actually we didn't find on average that there was any quote unquote trickle down effect in terms of the price premium actually ending up with the mills or with the laborers of the mills or with the farmers who provide the fruit to the mills. So there's something, the premium gets lost somewhere along that supply chain. And so the question is how does that happen? And how can we kind of design certification standards and schemes that are better at actually addressing inequalities on the ground? And also how does that link to environmental quality then on the ground? The other thing I want to briefly mention, and I'm keeping this very short because Tong Wu is going to be talking about this in a few minutes himself. It's the trilemma analysis that we did. This paper came out last year. The trilemma is this idea of coming back to this idea of trade-offs and synergies. Can you achieve prosperity, equality, and environmental integrity at the same time. And so we took this global view looking at national scale statistics for a bunch of different countries over a period of time, so not just a snapshot. And unfortunately, the bad news is, without taking too much of Tom's thunder, that no, we didn't find a single country where it actually was able to achieve those three goals at the same time. And in fact, there are some significant trade-offs between those goals. And in fact, there might even be some evidence for these sort of regimes where countries might even get sort of stuck in an inequality trap of some sort. So that's something that we're also pursuing further. And then the rest Tom can tell you about. And then finally, just to mention, coming back to this idea about behavior and the importance of behavior in the face of inequality, we have been designing behavioral economics experiments that we've been running with students from the University of Exeter to really try and unpack that whole story. Like, in a group setting where a group is meant to manage a resource that can collapse, how important is it that, what effect does inequality in that group have in terms of collective decision making, in terms of individual decisions and actions or inactions? Does it matter what kind of inequality? Does it matter how big the inequality is? Does it matter whether it's perceived to be fair? All these kinds of questions that are sort of on the table that we're trying to address with these behavioral economics experiments. So this was just a snapshot. Again, this is a big project, lots of people, lots of activities, but I can't go through it all. But if you want to know more, please talk to us later or check out the website. And that's it from me for now. Thank you.
Okay. Now I'll introduce our keynote, Lucas Chancel. Lucas Chancel is an economist specializing in global inequality and environmental policy. He is an associate professor of economics at Sciences Po, affiliated with the Center for Research on Social Inequalities and the Department of Economics. Additionally, he serves as co-director of the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics. Chancel's research focuses on the measurement of economic inequality, its interactions with sustainable development, and the implementation of social and ecological policies. He has contributed to major reports, including the World Inequality Report 2022 and the Climate Inequality Report 2023. His 2020 book on sustainable inequalities, social justice. Oh, sorry. And the environment examines the links between social inequality and environmental degradation. So the floor is yours, Lucas, and we'll give you a heads up when there are 5 minutes remaining in your time. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking and to be discussing with you all today. So the title of this talk is Confronting Inequality in a Finite World. And I wanted to start with very basic and I think foundational reflection about inequality and pollution, which actually was brought to us by Jim Boyce a little more than 30 years ago, where Jim Boyce presents pollution as an inequality problem. According to him, pollution happens because winners benefit from it. And if there's no winner to pollution, actually it's a trivial issue. It would be very easy to stop. But pollution also happens because there are losers. Otherwise, we would not even talk about pollution. Now, Boyce also notes that losers may not necessarily exist yet, might be future generations. They might be non-humans. They might not necessarily be aware they are losing. They might be aware they are losing, but they might not have enough power to stop pollution. And I think this is a very important way to frame the pollution problem, and that's one way that I will try to unpack in the discussion that I'd like to have today. I will draw from some of the publications that were just mentioned, including the Climate Inequality Report we published in 2023 with some of my colleagues at the World Inequality Lab, from also 2020 book entitled Unsustainable Inequalities, published by Harvard University Press, and more recent work on the matter. So economic inequality, I will try to argue, is really one of the landscape issues that we need to have in mind when thinking about environmental inequalities. And so I will spend just a few slides discussing what this landscape is about, looking at global economic inequality from a historical perspective. And then I will show how this historical perspective on global inequality is also related to current levels of pollution inequalities. And I will look also at the current global economic inequality picture and what it means when we are thinking about reducing carbon emissions or reducing material resource consumption throughout the world. Then I will look at climate inequalities as a trend accelerator, showing that climate inequalities stem from economic inequalities and have the potential to exacerbate them on top of already pretty high levels of economic inequalities, both between and within countries that we observe in the world today. And then, of course, the most important question of all here is, can we reconcile economic and climate justice? I will just say a few words on that, not pretending to crack the problem, but showing that there has been some progress over the past decades when thinking and acting on the matter, but there are still some important challenges that seem to me are left aside and that would merit to be more at the center of policy discussions. So let me start with the global economic inequality landscape. And I'm starting here 200 years ago. So this graph shows the evolution of global income inequality between 1820 and 2020, drawing from work done with my colleague Thomas Piketty, where we combined all the data we have on income inequality within and between countries throughout the world since 1820. And what the figure shows you here is the ratio of the average income of the top 10% of the world earners to the bottom 50% average income. So if the ratio is 20, this means that the top 10% make on average 20 times more than the bottom 50% of the world. And what you see on this graph is that the big moment of increase of global inequality, and please mind the scale, this is log scale, so multiplication by 2 for each horizontal line. Moment of big increase of global inequality between top 10 and bottom 50% is in the 90th in the 19th century, during colonial expansion and the Industrial Revolution. So we're moving from a world where this ratio that I was just talking about is about 20 times to a world where this ratio is about 40 times. There's a further increase that we observe from the 1960 to the 1980, but we see that, a big bulk of these global inequalities are created then. And despite some reduction in global inequalities that we observe since the 2000s with a compression of average income differences between countries, largely following the rise of China, we're still in this world of very large economic inequalities. And this is what I'm showing right now. So that's the snapshot, the current picture of global income and wealth inequality. On the left, presenting income, the global income distribution, and on the right, the global wealth distribution. So income, today, the top 10% make about 54% of all incomes in the world, whereas the bottom half of the world population makes less than 10%, 8% of total incomes. So that's for income. Now, if we look at wealth, it's much more concentrated. The top 10% make about they own about 3/4 of everything there is to own on the planet. And the bottom half of the world population owns about 2% of everything there is to own on the planet. So if the world was fully equal, we would have a top 10 share, whether income or wealth, of 10%. If the world was fully unequal, this top 10 share would be 100%. And so we see that we're somewhere between these two polar extremes, but when it comes to wealth, we are very much living in a highly unequal world. Now, this is the global level, but even if we zoom within countries or within regions, so this is what I'm doing here, I'm looking at wealth inequality within regions, we see that the top 10% own around 60 to 80% of the total in different world regions. There are some differences. Policy matters to reduce these inequality levels within different regions, but look at the bottom 50% everywhere. Typically, it owns less than 5% of the total. So even in a region like Europe, where wealth is more equally distributed, there's still a pretty striking amount of wealth inequality. And of course, this will matter when we think about solutions to climate change and solutions to the great overshoot of the world planetary boundaries. Now, a final point on economic inequality before I turn to climate. Policy matters. I just mentioned that, but I just would like to show you this very striking evolution of income inequality in the US and Western Europe between 1980 and 2016, where you see the evolution of the top 1% income share in red and the bottom 50% income share in blue as a share of total national income in these regions. In the US, there's this almost complete inversion of the relative position of these two groups over the period. The top 1% rises from about 10% of the total to 20%. And in Europe, you see some increase in the top 1%, but much less rapid. So policy matter, whether it is educational policies, policies in terms of access to basic services, whether it's tax policies that make it possible to finance public services, whether it's policies in how labor markets are regulated or industrial policies are made. What research on global income inequality and global wealth inequality has highlighted, it really is the importance of policy and the way and the fact that there's no determinism in the huge rise of inequality that some countries have observed over the past 40 years. Now, how does all this relate to climate inequalities? And I will focus on climate inequalities for the time being, leaving aside all other inequalities related to the biosphere. But I think we can already learn quite a bit of information when focusing on climate change. So this is drawn from some work done with my colleagues Philippe Botte and Tancred Voiturier, where we show what we call the triple climate inequality crisis. So what we have on this graph is three dimensions of global climate inequalities. In red, the distribution of climate-related relative losses. I'll come back to that in just a second. In green, the distribution of emissions and of GHG emissions. And I will also try to unpack what these green bars actually mean in just a few seconds. And in blue, it is the inequality of capacity to act on the transition. Here, they are proxied by wealth ownership. So capacity to finance the transition. And we're back to this very striking concentration of capacity to finance the transition or wealth inequality among the top 10% of the world population. Now, if we look at relative income losses, well, three-quarters are concentrated among the bottom 50%. So let's first look at this unequal distribution of harms. Research has been quite clear that poor countries are hit harder. So tropical, subtropical areas are going to be hit harder by a marginal increase in temperature due first to the temperature levels they start with, and second, due to the fact that these regions, these countries, have less capacity to adapt, have less resilience as compared to other countries. This graph from Ortiz Bobea and co-authors 2021 shows the agricultural productivity loss due to climate change. And we see here strong divergence, strong inequality across countries with minus 40% up to minus 40% or more in some very poor regions of the world. But beyond this between country effect, what social sciences, whether economics, whether geography, whether other social sciences, what they have uncovered over the past decade or more is that there is a strong inequality in how harms are going to be distributed or are already distributed within countries. So here I'm borrowing this word from Stefan Algat and Julie Rosenberg from the World Bank. We're looking at a panel of over 90 developing countries, looking at household surveys and how people actually, what they consume, what their livelihoods depend on. And then they're going to model the effect of climate shocks on the livelihoods of these individuals. And they find that the bottom 40% of the population is hit 70% more than the average. This is what you see on this graph with the income loss for the bottom 40% on the vertical axis being on average 70% more or 1.7 times more than the average income lost in the population as a whole. So there's also this concentration of harms, of losses within countries and within poor countries. Now, this is also true in rich countries as well. And here I'm borrowing some kind of caricatural representation of the problem. So this was an issue of the New Yorker magazine a few years ago, looking at a real project. It's called the Survival Condo Project in the Kansas Desert. It's an old nuclear silo that was bought by some real estate investors and transformed into a series of luxury lofts for multimillionaires, centimillionaires seeking for refuge in the face of the potential end of civilization as we know it. So there's a private army, there are fake windows with LED screens where you can basically choose to project whatever you want on your fake windows. So this is, the extreme case of climate inequalities of harms, with some parts of the population feeling that they can be protected much more than the rest of the population. Now, this applies to the world's centimillionaires, perhaps billionaires. And it's, as I said, caricatural, but we do observe this in real life. Now, I would try to also like to bring this back to more, general population kind of part of the discussion here. Beyond these extreme cases, we also live in the world where 10% of the global population, so basically the majority of the population in rich countries, not just the super rich, are much more protected than the rest of the world when it comes to facing the effects of climate change. They are going to be impacted. They are already impacted. We are all impacted, but not in the same way. And this also helps us understand this diversity of harms, why there has been so much lag in climate action, in particular by those who have the financial resources to act. Now, those who have the financial resources to act are also those who have been emitting the most. So, who contributed the most to pollution? Here, this is the overall amount of emissions, so historical emission inequality between countries or world regions. So that's now from 20 up to 2020. So we have a few years of to be updated on this graph, but the broad picture isn't changed. About half of global historical emissions released by Europe and North America. And when we relate this to the remaining carbon budget, we indeed see the stock um, um, the extent of the challenge ahead, with a key question: how to split the remaining carbon budget in a fair way across the world population. Now, if we look at emissions today, and if we look at average emissions between regions, we also see a fair amount of inequality. Uh, Average emissions in the world in 2019, about 6 tons of CO2 equivalent per person per year, about 21 tons in North America, about 10 tons in Europe, 1.6 ton in sub-Saharan Africa. And according to some calculations, if we're to split the carbon budget compatible with a 1.5 degree target, that would mean less than 2 tons of CO2 equivalents per person per year. Um, Now, one of the key questions here is beyond these average values, what are the levels of emissions between different groups of the population within countries? On that question, the latest IPCC report has been quite clear in terms of the general pattern that we observe. Individuals with high socio-economic status contribute disproportionately to emissions and have the highest potential for emission reductions as citizens, investors, consumers, role models, and professionals with high confidence. I think what's interesting here is to have a form of holistic perspective on how wealthy individuals might be responsible for emissions and therefore might be able to act upon the transition. And I would like to say just a few words on that from the perspective of carbon emission accounting. And what I would like to say is that depending on how we measure things, depending on how we think about responsibility of individual emissions, inequality numbers might be quite different. So let's look at a concrete example. This is carbon inequality in the USA in 2019, following the well-known consumption-based approach. So the consumption-based approach looks at all emissions released at home and abroad to serve the consumption of individuals. And if we look at that, we see average population in the US about 22 tons, the bottom 50% of the US population 14 tons per person per year, whereas the top 10% 52 tons and the top 1% 137 tons. So already a fair amount of inequalities between these groups. Now let me say straight away that these are average values by group. Within each group, you're going to have some diversity. You're going to have some degree of variance depending on where you live, depending on how you heat your home, of what are your personal consumption habits. But on average, we see this very strong gradient between groups. That being said, this approach is assuming that individuals are just consumers, nothing else, nothing more, nothing less. We're consumers. But in fact, in reality, individual choices might not only be related to consumption, they might also be related to the amount of savings we have, the amount of investments we make, and the decisions we make to invest some of the money that we save. We are also owners, some of us at least in the economy. And what I've seen is that there's also a very strong inequality in wealth ownership. And so this next graph here presents inequality of carbon emission in the USA from the perspective of ownership emissions. So not what individuals consume, but the emissions associated to the firms that they own, or to the shares of firms that they own at home or abroad. And here you see that the emissions inequality looks even starker than what we had in the previous graph. Bottom 50% emits 7 tons per person per year. The top 10% has risen to 800 tons. So here there's an important reflection to have when we think about carbon inequalities, emission inequalities. It can also apply to other types of pollution. What do we actually mean by responsibility? What do we actually mean by individual emissions? And the agency that individuals might have on these emissions. In some earlier work, I looked at an approach to measure emissions that is somewhere in between the pure consumption approach, which I presented initially, and the pure ownership approach, which I just presented in the last slide. I call this here mix-based. Some have called it final demand-based emissions. It's a framework where individuals are seen as having some agency over their consumption and a part also of what they invest, their savings. And here, and in this representation, that's where we obtain this elephant curve of global emissions inequality. So here you see the average growth rate of emissions between 1990 and 2019, where you see that for some groups of the global population, a relatively important increase in emissions per capita, around 30-40%, a decline of emissions for some groups in the global north, and a fairly important growth at the very top of the global distribution. We can come back to this graph, to this figure later on, but it shows that there are some inequality dynamics at play over the past 30 years. Let me now try to conclude this discussion by questioning this important point: how to reconcile economic and climate justice. And so I've already presented earlier global carbon inequality in losses, emissions, capacity to finance. Let me focus a little bit more on this capacity to finance dimension here. From the economics perspective, standard answers to environmental problems have really put a lot of focus on carbon taxation. The idea of carbon taxation is that there are some externalities related to pollution that are not priced enough in the cost of production of firms or of individuals. And by pricing this externality, by revealing to polluters the actual true cost to society of pollution itself, we will be able to reduce the quantity of pollution, the quantity of goods produced that are polluting. Very often, in economics audiences, that is the preferred way to go. Let's tax carbon. Let's make the prices right. And this approach has a lot of power. In some places, it actually has worked, and it will work in some cases in the future as well. But what we've also learned over the past decade or so is that carbon taxes on direct emissions are typically regressive. When we focus on direct emissions, so that is emissions at the petrol station, emissions related to energy consumption at the petrol station, or related to the fuels that we use to heat our homes, low-income groups typically face a higher burden than high-income groups. This was true in the case of the Yellow Vest movement in France, for instance, in 2018. This has also been true in many developing countries where we've seen episodes of social unrest associated with policies that sought to increase the price of fossil fuels. Now, I think on this dimension of the problem, we have seen some progress over the past 10 years. We've seen some countries or some regions that established carbon taxation schemes with compensation. This is British Columbia, for instance, but was also followed by Alberta, Switzerland, enlarged to Canada as a whole. You have carbon taxation scheme, but all, or if not most, of the revenues are redistributed to households, and they can actually be redistributed in a progressive way. Low income groups, middle income groups will receive more of these compensation than high income groups that might actually receive none of the compensation. So factoring in these differences in capacities to adapt. There's still a lot more to do in this direction, but I think this has finally entered policy mindset, and hence all the discussions related to the just transition. But to conclude, I'd like to focus on an underlooked dimension of inequality and climate change, according to me, and it's the following: in order to reach climate objectives by 2050 or 2100, a huge amount of investment will be needed in the world. One key question is who should make these investments? Who should own these investments? How should they be financed? And what will be the effect of the wealth that is created thanks to investing in new sectors on wealth inequalities in 2050, in 2075, or in 2100? On this figure, drawing from work with Cornelia Moran, Philip Botta, and Gregor Semyonuk, we look at the evolution of the top 1% wealth share at the global level, and we have two basic scenarios. These are completely hypothetical scenarios, but they show that depending on who finances the transition, who owns the assets related to the climate transition. So here, we're talking about the new energy systems or the new technologies that people will have to use in order to reduce our carbon footprints. This can have a huge impact on the share of the top 1% at the global level. And the same will apply within countries. And so to conclude, I would like to replace this discussion about the ownership and the financing of the technologies related to the transition with dynamics that we've observed at the global level over the past 40 years. And here I'm focusing just on rich countries, but this trend has also been observed in many emerging countries. This is the evolution of public wealth and private wealth in a set of rich countries. What we see is a secular increase in private wealth. So that is the wealth that is owned by the private sector, by private individuals. And at the bottom of the graph, you see the evolution of public wealth. So whatever is owned by the public sector. We see a secular increase in private wealth, a secular decline in public wealth. We might all have different visions, representation, preferences of where these spaghettis, so to say, should evolve in the future. One thing is certain: given the size, the investments needed in order to carry out the transition, according to some estimates, is 5, 6, 7% of a global GDP every year invested in the transition. These investments will have a huge effect on either the continuation of private wealth increase. They could also potentially contribute to rebalancing this inequality here that we see between public sector, private sector. We can think about futures where Elon Musk alone invest in the transition and will get all the financial wealth that is created associated to the investment in these assets. But there are indeed other scenarios in terms of wealth ownership. And these should be, I think, at the center of many of the discussions we have when we think about the future of the energy sector, the future of what we mean by an ecological economy. So let me conclude here. Climate change is a common and universal problem, but with differentiated harms, contributions, and capacity to act. It is an inequality problem. Radical transformation of energy systems are needed to reach net zero. To accelerate this, we need to cushion the worst off, not only ex post, but also in the design of climate policy. I've seen some progress. Still much more is to be done, but I've seen some over the past decade. Now, an important part of the discussion also is who should invest, who should own future climate investments. There are strong lock-in effects when we think about energy systems. Choices made over 2020-2050 will define the social and physical states of the world well beyond 2050. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lucas. And Lucas will join us in the panel discussion, which is coming up next. But as we're preparing for that, we'll give you all a few minutes just to stand up and stretch and talk to your neighbor and think about your ideas. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
More challenges.
Yes.
Indeed. But it's changing really fast. I mean, these numbers are very good to see. Like the wealth distribution changes. And I mean, we have these negotiations, the Paris Agreement and everything, so you need to have the facts to begin with.
Well, as you said, policies matter.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think policymakers at the top level, I mean, they have this information, but policymakers on local level, they don't. Because, I mean, they deal with everyday basis problems, and so they don't have the information.
I think part of this is making people understand it. Like you're saying, different levels of policy making, decision making, and this is a problem that affects everybody. I mean, it does seem a bit remote, or even if the impacts are kind of immediate, but you feel like you don't have the agency to affect that change. But I think it is about this kind of collective action challenge between everybody.
I think in more Australia's idea, I mean, when we, for example, managing forests or something, I mean, it's really hard to, this global overview makes sometimes you feel like, oh, I do that. But if you focus on the local environment and what you have sort of at hand, then it's much easier because, I mean, we are quite simple. I mean, human beings, we don't have the capacity really to, maybe some of you scientists, you have this very good overview, but when you work on this on a daily basis, I mean, you get really, like, you don't know how to have it.
It can be quite daunting. Right?
Yeah. Ja, men du är på Stockholm Resilience Centre? Ja, känner du igen dig? Från någonstans? Har jag sett någonstans? Här. Jag har också jag sa att it's a very depressing picture, but at the same time you have this actual change. So that's a good to realize. I've been working for this. Most policymakers are this sort of real local they don't have this. I mean, the panel's probably like a lot of climate change
It's amazing.
Maybe just hold this and I'll take it.
It has all the.
I don't know, I've been here, like on LinkedIn, on trying to connect with people.
So what is your
Well, in this project, I'm working on trying to understand like the economic gains of things. But I'm also working a lot with the struggle with the very
From the
really are, like through organizing. They should have, but one seat compared to I don't know how many.
Yeah, please start making your way back to your seats. We'll start in a minute. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Welcome back. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I'll introduce project team member Tong Wu, who will share a few words to inspire the discussion for the panel. Tong Wu is a senior scientist at Stanford University's Natural Capital Project, where he also leads China-related initiatives and collaborations. His research centers on the challenge and prospects of sustainable development in China and the Global South. Topics that he has worked on include the mainstreaming of biodiversity and ecosystem services into economic planning, the role of nature in public health outcomes, and strategies for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Currently, a major research focus is the development of gross ecosystem product as a policy instrument for aligning environmental and social economic imperatives. Please welcome Tong Wu.
Thank you, Tracy. It's almost as if I wrote that. It's always difficult to be the speaker after Professor Chancel. It feels like I'm a band that has to come on stage after the Rolling Stones have finished their set. And to make it worse, we have a very, very distinguished panel following, and so I'll try to do my best and get out of the way as fast as I can. Okay. But really, my job is quite simple, which is to set up the following conversation by describing to you what and why we did this work on what we call the sustainability trilemma. Now, of course, there are many different ways to frame sustainability, but we pursued this tripartite approach of focusing on the economy, the society, and the environment. And this slide is just to show, there's a lot of text, I apologize. I'm not going to read all the quotes. But this is really just to show that this is a way of framing development that has a very long intellectual pedigree, right? And so the economy, society, and the environment, it's often been called the triple bottom line. So in here, what some of these quotes are meant to convey is that, the economic problem, this is a way that the pursuit of affluence and prosperity has been framed for hundreds of years. Similarly, when you hear the social problem, quote unquote, the social problem, that's a term that occurs again and again in the economics and political economy literature dating back to the 19th century. So in Professor Chancel's chart, historical chart of income inequality, you see the social problem coming up in these classical texts again and again, right when that curve starts to accelerate, right? And then, of course, in our own time, we have the so-called environmental problem. So essentially, this means the pursuit of sustainability. How do we make living standards that are not just high, not just fairly distributed, but also sustainable or low impact over the long term? And so, again, to summarize, sustainability, we can say it has three essential nested dimensions: the economy, society, and the environment. And correspondingly, a normative definition of sustainable development would be the pursuit of a form of development that is meant to achieve high living standards that are also fairly distributed and have low environmental impact. But in this work, the question that we posed is, what if there is a trilemma that inhibits the simultaneous achievement of all three of these essentially desirable goals? And in our empirical work, we try to identify the spatial patterns and also the temporal trends of these three important indicators, or these three important dimensions, using what we consider to be representative indicators. And again, I won't get into too much of the details. Juan will present more on that in the panel discussion. But suffice it to say, as Micah mentioned, these charts are really impressive, but I won't go into the details. They're very colorful, they're very impressive. But what you need to take home from these charts is that, like Micah mentioned, despite our best efforts, we were not able to find a single country that met all three criteria. And so what that means is, yes, based on our empirical analysis, there is a sustainability trilemma. No country has been able to achieve prosperity, what we define as a reasonable level of equality and low environmental impact. And I think that's perhaps a troubling finding and troubling conclusion. But also I think it's a departing point of what we hope will be a very spirited intellectual enterprise and of course here, a very spirited conversation. And so finally, this is my last slide. You know, we have this very troubling conclusion. We've found a sustainability trilemma, and how do we solve it? Now here, what I would propose, and again, just by way of a starting point, is that perhaps one way to consider this challenge and this problem is that these three dimensions of sustainability that I mentioned, prosperity, equality, and environment, aren't co-equal dimensions. So in the triple bottom line framing, you often see these three as being co-equal. But of course, this is the Beijer Institute, and we are in Stockholm, so our preferred framework is actually the nested approach, as represented here by what's I think often called the wedding cake illustration of the SDGs. And then I'll just do a brief, a very small book recommendation, which is a book came out a few years ago by Pierre Charbonnier called Affluence and Freedom. And I think this book really conveys a very powerful message that's very resonant with our work, which is essentially that this is a work of intellectual history. What it shows is that, you know, whether directly or indirectly, our assumptions about nature's limit, the condition of the planet, and our place in the environment has served as a conceptual a priori to economic thought, as the book says. And so whether we can conceive of our collective economic lives and our political organizations hierarchically, in terms of egalitarian premises, all of them are essentially based on assumptions we have about the state of nature and our place in nature. And so I'll leave it there, and then I'll invite our, I'll invite our moderator to come. Sorry, I almost took Tracy's role, so thank you.
As Tong started saying, I'd like to invite our panelists down to take a seat, and as you're on your way down, I'll also introduce you. But yeah, please come and take a seat, Anna and Yolanda and Juan. Okay, so I guess going left to right, I'll introduce you all. So Yolanda Lopez Maldonado has partnered with leading organizations at UN levels such as UNESCO, the CBD, IPBES, to mention a few, to tackle complex social ecological issues. Her career spans cutting-edge research and diplomatic engagement, driving high-impact collaborations with academic institutions, international organizations, and policymakers to address global challenges. Her work focuses on integrating science-based evidence from both indigenous and Western science to foster trust building between nations and advance equitable foreign policies. Appointed as lead author as the UNEP Global Environment Outlook Report 7 and as a member of the Global Young Academy, she plays a pivotal role in shaping international environmental governance. A young scholar at the Beijer Institute of Ecological Economics, junior fellow at International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, Dr. Lopez Maldonado holds a PhD in human geography from the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich in Germany. Welcome, Yolanda. Yeah, we can hold applause here. Anna Jorborn brings a rich and diverse experience at the forefront of environmental governance, research strategy, and science policy dialogue. As the current CEO of Minstra, the Swedish Foundation for Strategic Environmental Research, she funds interdisciplinary initiatives that bridge environmental sustainability with societal progress. Her career includes leadership roles at the Swedish Environmental Research Institute, the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management, and contributions to global frameworks such as the UN Ocean Science Decade for Sustainable Development. Her insight is instrumental in reimagining governance regimes that balance prosperity with planetary boundaries. And last but not least, Juan C. Rocha is a research scientist at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. where he explores the frontiers of sustainability science through the lens of critical transitions and cascading effects. His work focuses on how regime shifts in one ecological system can amplify risks and vulnerabilities in others, revealing the intricate interdependencies that define our global biosphere. Juan investigates the dynamics of resilience, tipping points, and their consequences for society. His research is central to understanding the sustainability trilemma, how to balance environmental boundaries, human well being, and economic development, making him well positioned to discuss alternatives for navigating social ecological transformations. As a member of the Swedish Young Academy of Sciences, the Beijer Young Scholars, and several other international networks, Juan is also dedicated to science outreach and the development of tools that make complexity more accessible to policymakers and the public alike. And also welcome back Lucas Chancel. You can hear me well here? Okay, great. So starting off the discussion, I'll start with a question to Juan. Can you provide more insight into the trilemma study methods and particularly why you selected the indicators you did and how data availability influenced the focus of the analysis? And what data do you wish existed that currently does not exist?
So in the trilemma problem, we were trying to identify whether countries can achieve high standards of sustainability, high income, and low inequality. So what we're looking at was time series on those indicators. And imagine you have a kind of a cube where you want to bring that those countries to that hotspot, that sweet corner where they achieve the three goals at the same time. So what we're looking at was time series of any of these three indicators. It was really hard to find a good long time series for many countries. Some exist, but it's only for a restricted set of countries that doesn't allow us to see how the trajectories play over time and space. So at the end, we end up with the ecological footprint, the Gini coefficients for income, and then gross national income as metric of prosperity. What we find is that countries sometimes achieve two of the goals or improve in the right direction of two of the goals, but never on the three at the same time. And none of them arrive to that sweet hotspot of achieving the three at the same time. I think the work is interesting in the sense of putting out some of the patterns that Lucas and others have reported in the literature and outlining some hypotheses of why some countries might be trapped in these inequality traps, where because of inequality, they cannot perform well in other domains. I wish we had more inequality metrics in other aspects of inequality than income. Some of the gender, political dimensions, access to food or electricity, other. For some other variables, some data exists, but not this long-term series that allow us to see how the dynamics play in tandem.
Thanks, Juan. So I have another question. I'll start with Lucas here. But all can answer. So Lucas, can you imagine for us a scenario in which sustainability, equity, and prosperity are all achieved, and what policies at the country and international scales would be essential to getting there?
That's a tough one. Let's admit that. Maybe back to the trilemma that was presented before. To me, the fact that we do not observe any country in the world that does everything right and that is able to reconcile prosperity and sustainability, in the end, we also must acknowledge that it is not surprising. Basically, it's also what we know of the previous decades, that all countries, wherever they are in the world, how far advanced they are in the transition, will still need to make radical changes to their economies, to their production systems and their consumption systems. And so, so to me, in fact, I would not necessarily see this as, the realization of the doom scenario. It is the establishment of the basis of the problem, basically. We need some radical change. Now, I do think that it is possible to have prosperity and sustainability under very strict conditions. When we think about global inequalities, the condition under which we can maybe foresee a future of low carbon emissions in developing countries is really one of significantly higher transfers, financial transfers between the global north and the global south. Why? Because otherwise, many low income countries will continue to use fossil fuels as they are doing right now. And so, what do these transfers mean in practice? These can be explicit transfers through global funds. And there are existing global funds related to the transition, although the problem is that we're talking about a few billions or dozens up to $100 billion per year when we know that the amounts related to the investment needs in the global south are of the order of 2,500 billion per year. So that's one or two orders of magnitude above what is currently being transferred. But when we think about transfers, it's not just about explicit transfers. It's also really about thinking how low-income countries today still struggle to access capital markets, to invest in the technologies, the changes in the energy systems that they need. It is extremely costly for these countries to access global funds. So back to what I was saying before, we are in a world where capital is in the north, and there are huge damages in the south, and also huge investment needs in the south. And the situation today is that the South still struggles to access capital in the North. So we need some more transfers, and I think these transfers should be organized. I'm all in favor of more explicit transfers through global funds, but it's also important to think about the global financial architecture and how to reduce the cost of borrowing for low-income countries. And I think this is one of the many conditions through which we can start to think about a future where low carbon is compatible with the rise of the middle class, for instance, in low and middle income countries.
Thank you. I'll follow that up with a question to Yolanda. This is a multi-part question. So it's sometimes the case, Yolanda, that individuals can perceive lower and sometimes higher levels of inequality in their own lives compared to what the empirical data indicate. So how can this discrepancy between perception and reality be interpreted, and what are the primary factors that mediate the impacts of inequality on quality of life, which we often refer to as well-being?
Thank you for the question. I think it's important for me to bring another perspective, which is the perspective at community level, because we are talking here about global data sets and all this information and graphs that the majority of the people living at community level, they don't even know. For example, when you talk about how inequality is perceived, I think living at community level, you feel this inequality or perceive this inequality based on your social circle. And for example, if you owned a plot or a piece of land, you are a rich person. But in other societies, in other countries, you need to have money in your pocket in order to feel that equality. So I think it depends on your social circle and, let's say, your neighborhood. Also on social media or in the information provided to the people. And I think we as a scientist, we have a key role to play on that, in what is the information provided and how this information is interpreted.
Thank you. And related to the factors mediating the impacts of inequality and quality of impacts of inequality and quality of life?
I think this is a very complex question. There are, of course, several factors I really, it depends on also in the social context, because all the different groups, I will mention indigenous groups, all they are different, they have different perceptions, different approaches to inequality, and how they interpret the information is also complicated to explain it.
Thank you. Okay, and a question to Anna, and also, I guess I should have given the opportunity. Would anyone else like to respond to that question before I move on to the next? Okay. So in the current context of geopolitical instability, we have these tariff trade tensions and military conflict and increasing nationalism. Do you have any hope of making progress toward concurrent sustainability, equality, and prosperity goals within these next few years?
Thank you for the question. Actually, when I read the papers from this project this weekend, it's quite a grim sort of story that you outline. But I mean, I'm a positive person by nature, and I think it's a very good starting point for addressing this trilemma, because it's evident that there is a trilemma trying to both reach the goal of prosperity, equality, and biosphere integrity. And as a policymaker, I wish I had more of this kind of information, because I've been working for many, many years designing policies. There was a few examples in your paper about marine protected areas, for example. I think it's a simple, I mean, it's a good thing to have a protected area. I mean, it's going to work well. But actually, you have to go dig a bit deeper to understand how it actually works, because in this case, the local community is not always, it's not a positive thing for them, because they survive on a daily basis for fisheries, for example, and if they don't get food for their kids, suddenly they try to cheat. So a marine protected area, it's not just to put a protected area there and forbid fisheries, because it's not going to work. And the paper outlines these kind of dilemmas, which I think it's very valuable for policymakers. But talking about hope, I think there's a great hope by we sitting in this room discussing things. And I think there is a potential to really collaborate between science, policymakers, civil society, and join in finding solutions. But we need information then. So this paper is a good starting point. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to the question about hope in making progress towards these multiple goals?
I think we're on a moment of opportunity, to be honest. If you see a lot of the graphs that we saw before, for example, Latin America was very close to the budget that you need to remain under 2 degrees. So they have the technology and know-how today to remain there. We just need to make it better. We just need to rely less on fossil fuels and transition towards green energies. If you see, for example, the share of green energies in most developed countries, we are increasing substantially the amount of green energy reliance and decreasing substantially the amount of carbon emissions per country. So there are some positive trends. We are not just there, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been progress. And learning from the trajectories that some countries took, other countries can say, we don't need to go that way. We can create our own way. I think that has a lot to do with what Lucas was saying on transfer of technology and investment on the global south, but I also think it's an opportunity to rethink a bit our political systems and see some opportunities to, for example, reduce corruption in some of the Latin American countries, where that's one of the reasons why we have these inequality traps, or enforce democracy, so the policies and decisions actually reflect what the people want, not what some small dominant social class is willing to impose. So I think that there is other social values in there that are worth bringing up on the table. It's a pivotal moment. It's a moment where we can make a difference. So I think I'm on the page of there is hope. Definitely, we can make a difference in our lifetime.
Perhaps to add to the questions you asked to Lucas, that, for example, for me, I envision a place in which equality is achieved, for example, with universal access to health, to education, for example, where prosperity is achieved by promoting well-being or buen vivir over consumption, and also sustainability, where we keep the use of the resources within the planetary boundaries. And I'm not talking about an utopia. Indigenous peoples and local communities, they have been living like this since time immemorial. And I think looking at those knowledge systems, those practices for managing natural resources is also a possibility, or I can say, like, there is a hope in there as well.
May I add, since I'm a research financer and we finance a lot of big programs on topics like fair transition, fair climate transition. We look at carbon exit, we look at geopolitics, and we try to really find solutions, but we can't sit in our own space. We need to reach out and actually collaborate across different sectors, between different disciplines, to try to find solutions. So, I mean, a study like you have done is a very good starting point, but then, I mean, we have to have practitioners that is working on the ground, because things are not going to happen if we don't really focus on these problems. But I think there is hope, but it's not just describing the problem, we need to act as well.
Now, in this moment, we can start with some questions from the audience, as I'm sure you've been holding on to them for a while. And how we'll do it is maybe we'll start by taking 3 questions at a time. So if you raise your hand, I'll call on you, and we'll have 3 people ask a question, and then the panel can respond as they choose. Okay. So does anyone have a question?
Thank you very much, everyone, for the presentation and for Beijer for putting this together. I had a question for any of the panelists as well as Lucas, just in terms of since the 2022 report came out and some of these graphs were being very clear about where some of those differences are. I'm just curious as to what have you seen in terms of reactions to the information, to the report, and what's been put out, and has there been sort of any sort of backlash or pushback or resistance to the implications around responsibility that the data the report puts out, and as well, have you seen people mobilized around what the report was pushing out as well?
Thank you. We have another question to add to this group of questions.
Yeah, so I have a question for the panelists and also for Lucas. It relates to Lucas' comment about transferring large amounts of money from the north to the south. I'd like to challenge that in the sense that it feels to me like these large transactions of money will just keep the situation as it is, because we might be able to kind of steer away from greenhouse gas emissions towards green energy, but we're not going to be able to do this in terms of food and water and other resources that we heavily rely on. So in effect, it will just transfer more consumption to the global south. We're not going to see this breaking away from the trilemma. So my suggestion is that maybe we need to think of a whole restructuring of the economy and society and really think big. And one of those very large, I think, ideas that is going around, but I don't think it's still entrenched enough, is the whole concept of degrowth. And maybe it's time we start thinking about this kind of things seriously, and I would like to hear your thoughts about it.
Thank you. So we have 2 questions, one about reactions to the data, and one a challenge to transfers and a suggestion for consideration of degrowth. Anyone would like to respond?
Perhaps I can add to Alon's comment that, yeah, I agree with you completely because, for example, we are looking at green transitions and green energy, green everything, but this has a lot of impacts in communities in the global south. And those impacts are not represented in the data sets, or sometimes they are not even perceived as impacts by some countries. So I think focusing perhaps not in the growth, but in restoring our broken relationship with nature, in terms of how we produce food, how we consume food, how we cook food, and bringing back those ancient old traditions in which nature was respected is also a possibility.
An answer to you on this question. It's not really a solution, but actually as a financer, we decided to do a call on degrowth and accelerated circularity just recently. So we had a program portfolio on that topic because we really need more research also in that area. And at the same time, we also need to be better at negotiating, talking about the global sort of perspective. So we had also a call on green diplomacy, science diplomacy on green basis. So we're trying to provide the opportunity to scientists to explore these topics because I think it's really needed.
Lucas.
Thank you very much. I think these are great remarks. On the reaction part, I've seen a lot of interest in these dynamics, in this way to represent the inequality in emissions. I think it connects with some a dimension that some people were, somewhat not so clear about. That is, when you focus on consumption only, well, one of the thinking that you might have is that even low-income groups in rich countries, they consume a lot. They do consume more than what is needed to stay within planetary boundaries. And therefore, when we look at inequalities of emissions from the consumption perspective, there's a lot of effort to be done by everybody and also by the bottom 50% groups in rich countries. But at the same time, what's also true is that there's a high level of constraints in how we are, or some in societies, and here I'm talking about rich societies, are constrained to consume in a certain way. And they do not have options to consume differently. Whereas at the top of the distribution, you might have, different options to consume, but there are also different choices that you are able to make as an economic actor. And that's your investment choices, which are very rarely under the radar of these, or at least that were not so much under the radar of these inequality discussions. So basically, I think that since 2022, there has been more focus on these different ways through which individuals can act upon the transition, and the role of the very wealthy, I think, is fairly clear. Now, one point, however, I think that there's an interest in individualizing the problem, but the solutions are very much collective. And the solutions to how we collectively reduce our footprints, how we collectively reduce our material consumption are very much political and collective investments. And so when I'm talking about collective investments, it's also to make it possible for individuals then to be able to make the choices that we would like them to make in terms of reducing certain amounts of consumption. And so, have I seen some evolution there? We're still, waiting. But there has been some evolution in how Also, political discourses I've seen in some countries have addressed the question of climate inequalities. Now, on degrowth, I think that we need to degrow material consumption, in particular in the global north. Having two fridges, two refrigerators, as we observe in some households in North America, for instance, doesn't make sense from a planetary boundary perspective. Now, in the global south, having no refrigerator at all, I think that is, maintaining, keeping this statu quo is not a viable option in the 21st century. So this means some material growth in the global south. Now, how does all these changes? What's the impact of all that on GDP? Because often the degrowth discussion is you need to degrow GDP. Here, I'm really much of an agnostic in the sense that I think that the radical reduction of that is needed in some sectors of the economy, starting with fossil fuels, should also be thought in the context of some growth, very different, in other sectors. We talked about Buen Vivir before. I think in many countries, even rich countries, education and health are sectors that need to grow. What is the effect of all this on GDP? To me, it's a secondary question. We need to focus on other indicators than GDP. So degrow radically in some sectors, but we want to see some other sectors thrive. And I think that this is what the post-growth discussion and literature is trying to achieve.
How about another set of questions from the audience?
Hi, yes, I just wanted to find out a little bit more. I think this is a question for everyone, actually. Your thoughts on extensive inequality. We've spoken a little bit and alluded to not going into harm and social harms. We've talked a little bit about planetary boundaries and ecological tipping points, so staying away from certain lines of harm, be it environmental or social. But I don't think we've spoken much about when inequality is bad, because inequality is everywhere. It always has been. Inequality and relative differences between people in terms of power, in terms of happiness, in terms of amount of food, in terms of where you live, is something that will always remain in certain levels, and we all know that it's increasing a lot now. But to any of your knowledge, is there much done on dangerous levels of inequality for the environment? And if not, should we be looking into this?
Is there another question we can add?
I feel like there's been a really nice discussion about the biosphere in terms of primarily a climate impacts lens. And so I'm really curious about other dimensions of the biosphere and how inequality interacts with the environment, outside of just the context of climate change, maybe more local environmental governance challenges.
Thank you. Anyone would like to start?
I can give it a try. So the idea of tipping points in inequality has been attractive for some years. We did ask that question to Melissa Leach some years ago when there was a similar panel about inequality and the American Association of Sciences. She didn't believe that it could be a tipping point in inequality at the time, but she also realized that that's an opinion, that's something we haven't tested. On the data that we have, we show that there is this potential regime, so that evidence suggests that there might be tipping points or dangerous areas for inequality, but we don't yet understand very well what are the mechanisms that might create reinforcing feedbacks or that might create these tipping points to amplify or not. So I think that's a half-baked answer of some data suggests that they might be, but we will need to know what are the controlling variables, the controlling parameters in order to go on trying to figure out if that exists or not, and hopefully with more than income inequality, some other dimensions of inequality. Now, to Andrew's question about the biosphere beyond climate, there has been some work that we have been trying to do on that front. Unfortunately, the biodiversity data is scarce. You might have very nice maps, but only few observations on time at the global scale. So we're trying to figure out works around that. The guy behind you to your right is a master student, Rodrigo, who is comparing inequality at the neighborhood level for a number of cities and trying to compare that with the biodiversity of birds. For some cities, we know that there is a look-through effect where rich neighborhoods tend to have more biodiversity. They also tend to conserve more green areas and parks. We don't know if that holds for inequality. So he will be answering that question in a couple of weeks in his master's thesis. It's a really difficult question because of the quality of the data of biodiversity and inequality often are observed and measured in a very different time scales. So finding, winning the lottery to get the two of them to meet at the same scale and ask the question is being challenging, but there is some work on the pipeline for that.
To add to that, to your question, I think it depends on which group you are. For example, you have inequalities, you are having inequalities within two different groups. And unfortunately, the group always having more inequalities or having more impacts of those inequalities are the minorities. So it really depends on how you frame your question. In relation to other types of inequalities within the biosphere, I think one of the most crucial at this moment, which cause conflicts and war, is water inequalities. Some countries are taking more water than they need, and they are also, violating human rights and different very negative inequalities to minorities.
I'd like to get back to the data part. I think that's really a big challenge concerning ecosystem data. It's on social side as well, but these initiative on UN Ocean Science Decade that was focusing specifically on that, because we lack data in many countries describing the oceans, the coastlines, the biodiversity in these areas, and then we can't really address these questions. So I think it's very much a challenge to find data, and we also need to put resources into this to have the data for your analysis, in fact. However, I think it's the same in Sweden. We spoke about just the local community and the Same issue here. We have a person here in the audience. There's also inequality in the way you get information on the table or invited to the table with the information that you have in the discussion about ecosystems, for example. So even in countries like Sweden, we also have this dilemma. So we really need to work on data promotion in this kind of discussions.
Maybe to add on this, if I may.
Yes, please.
Yeah, maybe to connect the point that was just made on data and the first point about what's the actual good level of equality or inequality. I think there is no optimal level of equality and inequality. It's really a matter of political choice and democratic debate. And here, I think the work that was done over the past 20 years in terms of pushing inequality data in the public domain so that everybody would be able to understand, to measure things, understand what is happening, and contribute to public debates in the most informed way as possible, because before this information was not present. So I think this is another condition, data access, data availability, in particular on inequality, starting with economic inequality and then towards planetary boundaries related inequality is essential. Now, is there a level of inequality that makes things unsustainable, both from a political perspective or from an environmental perspective? I do think so. So I don't know what is the optimal level, but I know that the current situation, and I'm here thinking of the United States, for instance, of huge inequality levels with the promise of everybody being able to rise, that is not materializing in practice, can lead to the kind of political deadlocks that we are in today, and which has direct consequences on environmental policies, on environmental action, or on any kind of collective action to protect the public good because of this huge rise of polarization. So I think we've already reached this level of unsustainable inequality. Where exactly should we go? I think that's really the matter of public discussion. And I will stop here.
Okay. Do we have any? Oh, wow, we have a few questions here. We'll take all three. I'll start here.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted maybe touching back to what Lucas said and this graph where you showed in between country inequalities. Do you think that protectionism and what's happening now with global trade will possibly result in those in between country inequalities increasing as a consequence of less backtracking on globalization?
Since that was a direct question to Lucas, so I'll let Lucas answer right now.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I've heard you properly. So, what is the impact of the overhaul of the global trade order on between or on within country inequalities?
Between countries, because you showed a graph that between countries it has been decreasing. So if you would think that would bounce back.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to anticipate. It's hard to anticipate this because there's also a hit on some of the world's richest countries, starting with the US, right? So, what is going to be the effect of this global recession on global inequality? It's no, I can't say for for the moment.
Question here.
I'm Per Molander, former chairman of the Commission on Equality that published its report here in Sweden 4 or 5 years ago. I must confess I haven't read your publications on the trilemma, but I would nonetheless question the trilemma as a mode of thinking. Now the diagrams that were shown at the beginning showed a positive relationship between equality and prosperity, and a negative relationship between equality and environmental impact. So it seems that reducing inequality goes hand in hand with increased prosperity and decreased environmental impact. What seems to be the problem then is the positive relationship between prosperity and environmental impact. And I agree that there is, at the very aggregate level, a positive relationship here that's shown in the diagram. But on the other hand, firstly, given the disproportional share of the environmental from the upper 1% or 10%, redistribution within a population could create room for increased prosperity if we reduce the room for maneuver of the upper 10% enough. Secondly, there are different types of economic growth. There is growth based mainly on physical capital and growth mainly based on human capital. And the first category has a more severe environmental impact than the second one. And it so happens that also the second type of growth is coupled to increased equality. So in all, I would question this trilemma. I don't think the conflict is as serious as you painted it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Since that was quite a longer and multi-part question, just so that we don't forget the pieces of it, maybe let's address that one before moving on to the next one also.
I agree with your disagreement. I mean, what we did was plotting the trajectories of countries, forgetting about what the countries are or the types of development or the aspects that you just said. if I were to do the work again, you could run a regression controlling for those factors, and maybe you get some of the relationships that you are describing. What you describe a bit is the environmental goodness curve. We test for that. We did not find evidence with our data for that particular pattern or hypothesis. I would add also that despite there is different ways of developing the economy, for example, service-based versus resource-based, the way we measure ecological footprint account for additional resource impacts through trade. So even if your economy is service-based and you don't have much of resource consumption within your country, through trade you are externalizing some of that. Once you do that, all countries align more or less on the same type of pattern that we showed. So I take the point that we should be controlling for some of the aspects that you outlined, but in any case, we don't see any countries reaching this. In the graphs, we highlighted this blue box where the 3 goals are achieved. That being said, that doesn't mean that there is no countries moving right now on that direction. It's just they haven't get to that endpoint. Thanks for the question and the opportunity to clarify.
Can I add something?
Yes. Yes.
I think there was a very important point in the remark, which is that redistribution can be an important tool and lever to increase prosperity through basically different rules of the game in terms of material consumption. And in some discourses of the past few years, I've heard some voices say that, in fact, it's very bad if we redistribute because money from top to the bottom, because in fact this will mean that low-income groups or middle-income groups would actually consume more, and that there will be potentially more pollution because of the nature of the curve linking income and pollution. I won't get into the details, but that's one of the arguments that was made. And in fact, I think that we should really see, and I think that was the idea of the remark, that no, redistribution can be this very useful tool to combine rising levels of prosperity in a lower material consumption world. And because redistribution can be financial transfers, it can also be redistribution in the sense of better access to relational goods, better access to education, better access to health, better access to cultural services, which have a much lower material footprint than other forms of material goods. So when we think of redistribution, it's also important to think about redistribution through social and public services. And I think this is a very important part of the equation as well from the political perspective. If we want to have majorities supporting any transition pathway, we need to have more than 50% of the population that adheres to this transition pathway. And one way to do this, if we are capping material consumption at the top, there are ways to redistribute positions, wealth, access to some services that have a relatively low material impact.
Okay, another question here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this really great session. I work for Oxfam, and I was an author of one of these reports on climate inequality that we have done some thinking on this, and I think increasingly I come to the conclusion that power inequality is maybe the most important. If we can show and measure emissions, income, wealth, and we tend to focus on things that we can measure, but this power inequality is probably the biggest issue and making us locked in this business as usual and blocking the transformation. So I'm just curious, with all these great brains we have here, like how can we study it better, illustrate it better, tackle it, and because I think this is where we would like to be able to say more, but it's more difficult than measuring income or wealth.
And also another question.
Yes, and that was a great seminar and great question, because it was very related to mine, which is on the sort of voice, who has a voice. And in these times, I mean, those, if we say that the 10% that have the power of the voice, I mean, in social media, in media, in different forums of decision making and so on, they might be interested to keep status quo and not to work with these issues. So I think who can access and who's heard and who is also, I mean, there's a lot of studies also on the pushback or, yeah, as we know. So I don't know, this is maybe not something you have studied, but I mean, today it's banned to work with inequality in some places, so I think it's something to look into.
Anyone would like to take on?
Perhaps I can try to respond. When we talk about power, we are talking about the policy-making framework. The politicians have also power, and one way that scientists can influence policymakers is through these studies and showing the real facts, the real data, and also trying to bring other voices to the conversations. Like, for example, we have a lot of experts that are not economists or scientists on this topic that can also bring important facts and important data to policy making. So I think it's a way to deal with the power asymmetries. And I can give my example. I'm an indigenous scientist, so for me, I'm working and collaborating with different UN organizations and trying to bring bring this information to policymakers because we want to influence policy and practice as well.
I think it's a very good idea to look into the power inequality, and just to mention, we have a program called Mr. Food Futures, which Stockholm Resilience Centre is also part of, and in the second phase they looked into the power inequality and the power in the food system. So I think indeed that is something that could be further sort of studied. But I'm a bit curious, and maybe I'm going ahead of your idea as a moderator, but I'm really curious what is going to happen. What is the next study that this group is going to perform? I mean, there's so many good ideas and leads for the next study or a couple of studies. So what is the plan? I'm so curious.
Well, they're all big studies that require huge amounts of funding, I think. We're very ambitious.
Oh, so that's why I'm sitting here.
No, I think one of the ideas that we were discussing was to really include practitioners and not and to avoid this only theoretical part, but also to engage with citizens and citizen science. I think it's an opportunity as well.
Sounds like a good idea.
At least for
Looking forward.
Let me answer briefly the power question, and then I get back to you. That's a very important question, and with the group of the Beijer young scholars, I've been losing hair with the years, with the discussions, trying to figure out how we measure and how we study that. My answer is incomplete, but the halfway we've been doing is trying to identify actors that have disproportional power, disproportional influence on the system. For example, Patrick is working with Cibos, some of the biggest seafood companies in Indonesia, to understand in what way the way they manage and engage with the resource exploitation can shape inequality or not. Andrew is doing some agent-based models on market concentration and trying to understand that, both on the ground and theoretically, how that disproportional position of certain actors can increase or not inequality. So that's one way. It's really hard to observe, and the stuff that I do is typically I need time series, I need data, and where do you get to observe that power beyond the particular case study where you can spend a lot of time. And then that leads to your question. We are interested in going beyond income and wealth. I think groups like Lucas and Piketty and others have been terrific progress in the last couple of years on that front, making the World Inequality Database available for us to use. But we're thinking what other dimensions of inequality we could be studying. People like Prabhat Das Gupta assumes that income is going to be a very good proxy of all the others that we cannot observe. That's an hypothesis to test. Maybe there are some inequalities that for which income is not a good proxy, and the problem is how do we observe them, how do we track them, So that's one of the directions we're trying to go forward. And then trying to really link mechanistically how inequality is affecting the biosphere and how changes in the biosphere can feed back inequality, which was, the initial dream idea that brought us together some years ago.
That sounds good. As a policymaker, you want ideas about solutions, and reading this paper, you get a bit depressed. But I think the next step is actually to look into what can we do. I mean, are there policy decisions that need to be done? I mean, how can we collaborate to really solve some of these challenges? So I'm looking forward to read that paper.
On it.
Yeah.
Do we have any final thoughts before we close out? I think, are we at time? Yeah, so maybe we can save the questions until we have a bit of a social minute outside for coffee. But before that, I can just give a few final thank yous. And so first to our speakers, Micah, Tong, Lucas, and to our panel members, Anna and Yolanda and Juan. Thank you for the audience. We're so happy with the turnout this afternoon. I'd like to thank Formas and the Beijer Foundation, who's generously been supporting the Beijer Young Scholars for many years. And so we'll close it out, and please join us in the foyer outside for a coffee mingle to continue this discussion. Thank you so much.